morning, good afternoon, good evening all, it's Bear here. And I'd like to welcome you to my YouTube channel, aboxwithnolid, a channel I've created to not only delve into the realities complex trauma creates, but also really get into the mechanisms and the understandings needed to improve the quality of life and to heal. Now, this is the next video in the adoption series. And yes, there are a lot of videos on the fog, but the fog is the primary base structure within adoption trauma that we have to work with. I need to really get the understanding across to all. It's almost infinite nuance. And in this video, the reality faced when the fog collapses. For so many of us, as I've said in previous videos, I've seen far too many adoptees just stop. It overwhelms the body to the degree that they just stop, they pass. And that's one of the primary motivators for a lot of the work that I've done trying to advocate for change and understanding within the world of adoption. It's because I've lost too many people that I've known and care about. I've faced my own experiences when my fog collapsed when I was in Canada and nobody understood it. And yes, it nearly killed me twice. I was resuscitated and had an NDE. I've had several NDEs in my life, near-death experiences. And what it creates is such an overwhelming frustration because nobody gets or values what the fog is. Hence, there's going to be a lot of videos on this. Even if people don't watch them, I'm still making them because it needs to get out there in the evolution of understanding because each person interprets differently. When we look at the fog, this all-encompassing structure, the understanding from a therapeutic perspective is you have the infant self, the child, and you have the avatar created when placement happens. That survival state of trying the fog creates an avatar self. When you're looking at it from a therapy perspective, there is a huge challenge in accessing the infant that needs to be healed and not just trying to rebuild and reinforce the fog, which is a trauma script. The next video I will go more into the therapeutic aspect, but that is the critical understanding needed when you look at this because it creates fundamentally two people. You have an infant stuck at a point, usually just minutes post-birth, highly traumatized in this trauma state that is repressed, this conscious being, and an avatar, a survival script that's created. Now the fog, when it collapses, and for most adoptees it will at some point, either it's a slow progression or, unfortunately and sadly for a lot of us, it's a crash. What happens is that infant surfaces and has no resource to deal with the world because it's an infant or a very young child. That highly traumatized, which is our true self, is there trying to cope with the reality of the world. Everything overwhelms. There is no skills, there's no life experience, there's nothing neurologically, neurophysiologically, or within our entire physiology there to cope. From a therapeutic perspective, they always go to rebuild the avatar. But the avatar's failed and it will fail again. It's a trauma script. It's a survival script. It's not a person. So that's the reality you're faced with when the fog collapses. The person that is trying to cope with everything and all the demands of an adult life, neurologically and emotionally, is an infant. with all the needs and requirements of an infant. I'm not meaning this to sound degrading or insulting. It's not like a child's mind. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about this whole felt sense body, this being is there. We all know that when we go through trauma, a large part of us remains at that point of trauma. Well, for adoption, the trauma is removal. It's usually at birth. That's the person that is present. And the gap between a collapsing avatar who is trained to deal with the world and this overwhelmed infant is vast and highly complicated to navigate. Hence the overwhelmment, hence why it ends a lot of adoptees. Either they just stop, or this is also why the suicidality is so high in adoptees. Because no one gets it. When I got sick in Canada and the fog collapsed for me, no one got it. And I was so degraded and humiliated, even by those I thought I was in a relationship with my partner at the time. Everybody left because nobody got it. And I couldn't explain it because there's the infant trying to explain it. That's the reality of the fog. I will never name names of people that I've talked to about this before, but I've known instances where, I've raised one before, a deathbed confession. I've known a couple of these. But no one valued it. I've known others that found out that they were adopted when their adoptive parents passed and the will came to the forefront and they had biological children. And the biological children went, well, no, you're adopted. You're not part of this family. And that is surprisingly common. So you have this infant self. By all accounts, you got this infant trying to deal with the emotional burden of not only their entire reality collapsing, but having to make the decisions and choices to be understood, to get help, and to cope and deal and learn. And it's almost an impossible ask. This is the reality of the fog. Therapy they don't even grasp it, which is one of I've spent decades trying to get this understanding across, and it is always dismissed because the focus is on the avatar. When the fog collapses, if the fog completely collapses, you cannot rebuild the avatar because the survival script was created when you were an infant or when the person was an infant. They're not in a maternity ward in a box being prepared to be passed over to an adoptive family. They're an adult trying to make sense of their entire reality collapsing. You cannot rebuild the fog. It's a learned process. It's a cognitive process that has failed. And in other videos, I want to try to start to delve with ways of working to heal that when the fog starts to collapse, and also to work with adoptees that the fog hasn't, because at some point it will. The older we get, the more at risk of collapse it becomes. The younger we are, it's reinforced. The focuses are different. But the older you are, the more emphasis is on connection. The body starts to fail. The aches and pains and your ability to do things starts to wane. The emphasis is on emotional connections and emotional interactions. Well, as most adoptees, we have this barrier, this separation because of the fog. So those aspects of interaction are not there or to the depth required, and that's why the fog starts to collapse. Then all it takes is an illness or something to happen, and it gets worse and worse and worse. This is why the development and working to create therapies are so critical, and the numbers are there. There are literally millions and millions and millions of adoptees in the world. It's not like you're dealing with just a few people. But the understanding needs to be there too. And hence these videos that I will keep putting out there with the hope that the right people hear them. Is you cannot rebuild a failed survival script. You need to rebuild and heal the person. When you're trying to work with healing the person, you're dealing with the understanding that you have to work with an infant in an adult body. You have to create the experiences that infant requires to develop as any infant would into a healthy adult. That is the obstacle to healing trauma, healing this type of trauma. And that is the understanding I need all of you out there to grasp. There is a reason why we are more separate in many instances, even as much as we pretend that we're not. We are, because of that avatar. And avatar is the only way I can put it. That is simple enough to understand. None of this is intended to be insulting or degrading to any adoptee, to any of us. But I'm just trying to explain the reality of this. So when we're faced with healing from adoption trauma, when we're healing the fog, as I've said a few times, we are facing an infant that needs to develop and learn healthily. As always, I love your guys' comment and feedback. Stay safe, be respectful, and I'll see you next time. Ho.